Welcome to the Thoughtful Leader podcast. My name is Ben Brearley. I'm a leadership coach and the founder of Thoughtful Leader. The Thoughtful Leader podcast is all about short, sharp leadership advice because thoughtful leadership is good leadership. Welcome to episode 325 of the Thoughtful Leader podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about the challenge of whether you should address a problem directly. That is, you might directly speak to a person and openly address a challenge that you are having in the workplace. So it's an interesting one that trips a lot of leaders up, and I want to get into this topic right now. So sometimes I receive correspondence from listeners or readers of my articles on Thoughtful Leader, and I had a question recently where someone was explaining a situation where a person that was working for them wasn't obeying their orders or following their directions. And so what would happen instead was they would tell that person to do something, and that person, instead of following that direction, would go to this person's manager and talk to them about the issue rather than addressing it with a direct line manager, which I thought was really interesting, but also not uncommon. You see this sort of thing happening quite a lot in the leadership or the workplace, wherever you are. So a few things here, and often when this sort of situation happens, the first thing I'm interested in is, okay, what have you done about it already? Have you talked to anyone? Have you tried to address it? So it turns out that this person's manager was doing the right thing, which was they were redirecting the query back to the actual line manager who should be addressing it. So that's a positive thing. And so, because sometimes that can happen, a person 2 levels below will go up above you in your leadership role and go to your manager, and then your manager will address the query rather than redirecting it back to you. Now, that's a problem. But in this case, that wasn't happening. The manager was saying, well, no, you should talk to your line manager. So that's a positive thing. So then I did ask the question, have you addressed this with the person directly? And the answer was, well, no, I haven't at the moment. Now, it's an interesting question. It's the most obvious thing I can think of. And I've been doing leadership coaching for about 7 or 8 years now. And I've been leading people for, 16 or odd years. Now I'm self-employed, but it's the first thing that jumps out at me. Okay, have you addressed it with them directly? And this isn't some sort of magical leadership advice or, you should use this leadership model. This is really just sort of a common sense thing. So I'm interested in, why don't people do this more often? Why don't we have that direct conversation where we actually just ask the person, well, is there a reason why you're not following my direction? And there's a couple of reasons I think we don't like to do this. Because it's an obvious thing to do, but a lot of people don't do this. And the first reason is an obvious one, that it's confronting. It can be quite confronting to directly question someone about why they're not doing what they should be doing. It's a very direct approach. And a lot of people, particularly thoughtful leaders, don't really have that direct style, and therefore it can feel, come across as aggressive, for example, which is often not what we want. The second thing that I notice is that there's probably a bit of embarrassment or shame associated with this interaction. So if you are the formal manager of somebody and that person is not following your direction, and obviously this happens a lot in the workplace in various situations, then it's sort of embarrassing that that person is not regarding your formal authority and you're having to talk to them about it. Because people can look at you and say, well, if you were a good leader, people would be following you. They're obviously not obeying you because they don't think you're credible or competent or whatever it might be. So it can be embarrassing, and then it can be, and I think there can be sometimes a shame attached to that embarrassment as well, in terms of I'm ashamed because if I was a better leader, I'd be able to get this person to follow my directions, which is an interesting frame of mind, because sometimes, obviously, we can't control everything that other people do, even in leadership roles. And your formal authority only goes so far. And I've spoken about this before in terms of the types of power we might have available to us in the workplace. So your formal authority is one source of power, which is obviously it comes from your formal role, which means anyone in your role would be able to exercise that power. For example, if you're the formal leader, you can sign off on timesheets or sign the purchase order or approve something. That's your formal authority to do that. And it's probably in your job description somewhere. Now, the other types of power are less about the role itself and more about you as a person, and they are your knowledge power or expertise, which is, if you know a lot about a certain topic, you might be able to influence using that knowledge, or people might require that knowledge, and so they'd come to you as the expert. The other side of it is the what's called referent power, or you could sometimes just call it people power, and that's all about, your ability to build strong relationships with other people and influence people based on that, which is more about, people want to follow you because you have a good relationship with them and you've got good trust and all those things. So obviously if we rely on formal power too much, it can reduce our credibility because it feels like we're just telling people what to do and we're using an argument that goes along the lines of, I'm the boss, so you should do what I say, which is not a great way to build credibility. So the other two types of power are available to us, your expertise and your people power. But as I mentioned, I think there's a degree of shame involved when people don't obey our orders. And it feels like if we have to go and tell our direct report that actually I'm your boss and you have to do what I say, it's very direct, it's very confrontational, and it should actually be a last resort. And sometimes we catch ourselves thinking, I shouldn't have to do that. I shouldn't have to do that. They should just follow my orders. Now, as we know with people, they are unique and special and they're complex. And so there can be many reasons why someone doesn't follow your orders or your directions. And it's interesting to think about some of those sources of power. So in this situation that I mentioned before, where the person contacted me about it, it's clear that the formal authority is not doing the job for you. Because if it was, they would just sort of follow your direction anyway, because they might be afraid of the consequences of not doing so. So we'll look at the other types, and could it be that that person doesn't regard you, your direct report doesn't regard you as a credible or knowledgeable source of information, and therefore wants to check it because they don't believe that your direction is the best way? Or is it possibly that your relationship with that person, your direct report, is such that they don't trust you, or it's a rocky relationship where they don't get along? Maybe there's a personality clash, and therefore they don't want to deal with you. They don't want to tell you they disagree, and they'd rather just go around you instead. So this is a really interesting sort of dynamic here. And so the obvious question, as I mentioned, okay, why don't you address it directly? Now, obviously the problem with this in the long run, if you don't address it at all, is that performance can suffer, because if people aren't following your direction and your direction is what they should be doing, then that could be some sort of issue in the workplace, whatever the work is that you're doing. The other thing is that it can have the ripple effect of decreasing your credibility over time. So if people aren't following your lead and you're their boss, other people looking at that might lose respect for you and your reputation could be damaged. So clearly we need to do something about it here. But I've always seen it as it is a last resort if you have to tell people, I'm the boss, you must do what I say. And it can actually lose credibility for you that way as well, because you're relying on that formal authority and you're being very authoritative. So really, I think the best way to address this directly without actually being authoritative is to approach the situation with curiosity. I mean, I was very curious when this person told me about this issue, because I was thinking, well, that is interesting. Why is that person not following the direction and going around the line manager? I think that's very interesting behavior. And the way to approach it with curiosity rather than directly accusing someone or blaming someone like, oh, you don't follow my orders, you don't follow my direction, is to, approach it with curiosity. So the first step in that is to just state what you've observed. So in this situation, you might say something like, hey, I noticed that when I wanted you to do that task, you actually went and talked to my manager instead without addressing it with me first. So I'm just curious, what was it that made you go talk to my manager rather than just telling me if you've got an issue with the task you need to do? So you're stating what you've observed, right? You are stating based on observed behavior. You're not using hearsay and saying, well, you don't follow my orders, you're disobedient, or you're not a good worker, or whatever it might be. You're not making that judgment call. You're simply stating the facts. And then, as I mentioned before, you're really going, okay, I'm interested in, what was it that made you go talk to my boss instead of actually just coming to me? Because I'm always willing to hear any issues you might have with a direction I'm giving. So you're asking, and you're really putting it back onto them. You're making them accountable for what's happening here by saying, oh, what is it? What is it? What are the factors? Notice that in this case, I try not to use the word why. Why did you do that? The reason I try to avoid it, and it comes from my coaching training, is really because why can come across as judgmental. And I find you often get better results or better answers if you turn the why into a what. So what is it that made you go talk to my boss rather than why did you go talk to my boss? There's a slight nuance there. So sometimes I avoid saying why just to get a better response and to hopefully provoke less of a defensive response. And then it's up to them. At the moment, it's up to them. You've said, hey, I'm curious, what's causing this behavior? And really, your job then is to listen to what they say. And they might say, well, I didn't think you really knew the answer here, so I went to your boss, or whatever it might be. And then you start to get somewhere. This direct questioning approach does two things. The first thing it does is it shows them that you've noticed this behavior and that you're willing to do something about it. So it shows them that you've noticed, which is a really powerful signal in itself, because sometimes they might think, oh, they're not saying anything, they probably don't even care. But now it shows you've noticed. The second thing it does is it provokes a response. When you directly question someone like this and you're curious, it means they have to tell you something. And if they don't tell you anything and they say, oh, no, it's nothing, then that's a really weird behavior, right? So you can question that as well. You can say, hey, I'm curious though. This has happened a few times. What's going on here? And so you might hear something that's interesting to you that you didn't expect. And that is the benefits of being curious. The other thing that is beneficial about this approach, rather than being authoritative, is that it can build credibility because you're not flying off the handle and getting angry and overly emotional. You're just saying, hey, I noticed this. I'm really interested in what's going on here. And what you might say instead, not instead, but at the end of this conversation is, hey, well, what I'd like to see next time is it'd be great if you've got an issue with the direction I'm giving, for example, or you've got a question, it'd be great if you just come to me first and we can discuss it. And if there's something we can't solve between us, then yes, we can talk to my line manager. But ultimately, it should be just between us to start with. And then you can workshop with them on how we might get there and what are the barriers to that happening and if there's any potential issues. So that's the sort of process I suggest, because these days it's really it's not a great look to be authoritative these days that much. Old school leadership is not so in fashion now, as in barking orders and telling people you must do this. A lot of good leadership is based on relationships and trust. And so this is a good way to address the problem directly without being authoritative. So I'm interested in what you think about this approach. Have you done this before, or are you having a similar challenge? Let me know on the show notes page. You can leave a comment there, thoughtfulleader.com/podcast/325. I'd love to hear what you think there. And of course, if you want to work with me to solve some of these team problems yourself and get my help and support with that, you can investigate leadership coaching as well. There's a link to my leadership coaching page on the show notes page, which you can check out and get in touch with me that way too. So hopefully you found this episode useful. Once again, I'm interested in your thoughts. So let me know on that show notes page, and I'll be back next week.